Most people think a woman leaves suddenly. They believe it happens after one argument, one mistake, one final fight. But that's an illusion. When a woman walks away, departure happened long before her feet moved, long before the goodbye, long before the silence. What truly ends a relationship is not anger. It's a quiet psychological shift. A moment when something inside her reorganizes, when hope withdraws, when her inner world no longer sees a future worth fighting for. Today, we explore the 5 hidden psychological shifts that occur before a woman walks away. Shifts that are rarely noticed, often misunderstood, and almost always irreversible once complete. If you understand these, you don't just understand relationships. You understand the human psyche at the moment it chooses self-preservation over attachment. In the beginning, she speaks. She speaks with urgency, with hope, with the subtle desperation that only someone deeply invested can carry. She tries to make sense of the confusion, to illuminate the cracks she sees widening between her and the one she loves. She repeats herself in different ways, her words weaving themselves into arguments, into explanations, into pleas, trying every tone, every angle, every fragment of herself to be heard. She wants understanding. She wants acknowledgement. She wants validation. And she gives it in full measure, believing that if she can just articulate her pain, if she can just map it carefully enough, then the other person will understand and respond. But expression, when it goes unheard, begins to exact a toll. Every unanswered word, every shrugged off emotion, every dismissive gesture chips away at the fragile scaffolding of hope that carries her, until she begins to realize that her efforts are met with resistance, indifference, or worse, outright denial. The shift does not happen in a single moment. It is subtle, almost imperceptible. She does not suddenly close her mouth. She gradually withdraws her words. She begins to speak less, not because she has nothing to say, but because she recognizes that speaking no longer alters reality. Her voice becomes quieter, more cautious. She may still ask questions, still offer thoughts, but the fire in her expression dulls. The emotional resonance that once accompanied her communication diminishes. She is conserving energy, not giving away pieces of herself that will not be received, not giving emotional currency in a system where it is devalued. Psychologically, this is a protective mechanism, a boundary silently erected against ongoing dismissal and invalidation. Every person has a threshold for how much they will give before the act of giving becomes an act of self-sabotage, and she has reached hers. What is crucial to understand is that silence is not emptiness. It is not the absence of feeling. It is a deliberate and intelligent strategy of the mind and heart. When she stops expressing herself outwardly, she is not withdrawing because she no longer cares. She is withdrawing because she has learned that her care is not met with reciprocity. There is a kind of brilliance in this silence, a wisdom born from repeated encounters with resistance. In the quiet, she preserves her dignity, her sense of self, her emotional integrity. It is here, in the space of unspoken words, that she begins to observe herself more clearly, to feel herself more acutely, and to realize that the energy she once poured into explaining herself could be redirected into cultivating her own inner stability. This is often misread by the partner as apathy, calm, or resolution, when in truth it is the first stage of detachment, a precursor to the ultimate decision of departure. Real life illustrates this pattern with striking clarity. There are countless stories of women who have pleaded with partners over months and years, articulating needs for emotional presence, respect, or support, only to find themselves met with repeated indifference. The complaints, once urgent, once charged with feeling, are eventually rendered invisible, and she notices, painfully, that no change occurs. Gradually, she begins to speak less in daily life. She stops asking for acknowledgement. She no longer seeks reassurance. When a partner believes they have finally achieved peace, what they have actually witnessed is the quiet recognition that the relationship has begun to fracture at the deepest level. And she does not announce this shift because it is not performative. It is internal. It is intimate. It is the mind and heart adjusting to the truth that her expressions, her emotions, and her essence are unheeded. The consequences of this shift are profound. Silence changes the dynamic of the relationship in ways that are invisible, yet irreversible. Emotional communication is the lifeblood of human connection, and when it stops, the bond itself begins to weaken. When she no longer expresses dissatisfaction, her needs, her fears, or her desires, the partner is left with a hollow imitation of the woman they once knew. It is not that she has changed dramatically, it is that the channel through which she connected has been blocked. Attempts to reach her feel like grasping at shadows. Her quietness communicates more powerfully than words ever could. A boundary drawn, a statement of self-preservation, a recognition that the emotional cost of being heard and not received is too great to sustain. This shift is often misunderstood. Many interpret it as a signal that she is fine, that the problem has disappeared, that the relationship has stabilized. But nothing could be further from the truth. Her silence is a mirror, reflecting the lack of resonance in the relationship. It is a warning, a final gift of clarity before a decision is made that may be irreversible. The shift from expression to silence is not an ending in itself. It is the process by which she measures, analyzes, and ultimately decides whether staying is viable. It is the mind's way of creating a safe interior space while the exterior chaos continues. Perhaps the most painful aspect of this shift is that it occurs long before any external signs are visible. She may still participate, still function, still care in subtle ways, but her inner world has quietly reorganized. Every word she no longer speaks is a testament to the recognition that her emotions are self-contained, her voice unnecessary for the preservation of her dignity, her soul not negotiable. And it is this silence, this internal recalibration, that signals the beginning of a journey from which the relationship may not recover. Once she has adjusted her expectations, withdrawn her emotional investment, and prioritized her inner equilibrium over the need for acknowledgement, the trajectory of her presence in that relationship has fundamentally shifted. The expression, once abundant, has been transformed into quiet self-assertion. The silence is not emptiness, it is a declaration, a prelude, a psychic pivot towards self-preservation, and it is almost always invisible until the consequences unfold. Most people think that when a woman walks away, it is because she no longer loves. But love does not vanish so easily. Love is resilient, it survives neglect, imperfection, and disappointment. What disappears first, often silently, almost invisibly, is hope. Hope is the quiet engine that keeps her heart invested, that convinces her to give another chance, to stay another day, to believe that things can be different. Hope is what allows her to tolerate being misunderstood, being dismissed, being hurt, without closing the door completely. When hope is alive, she endures, she explains, she sacrifices. Love alone is never enough to leave. Hope is the thread that ties love to possibility, and when that thread snaps, love may remain, but the connection cannot. Hope dies slowly. It does not announce itself with a dramatic exit. It creeps in while she is still loving, still caring, still smiling when she wants to cry. It begins as doubt, subtle and quiet, a whisper at the edge of her mind. She notices patterns, repeated failures to understand, repeated promises unkept, repeated moments where her feelings are minimized or ignored. At first, she frames these as anomalies, exceptions, or bad days. She tells herself, tomorrow will be different. Next time, he will see me. Next time, it will matter. This is hope in action, a sacred trust she places not only in another person, but in the future itself, in the possibility that love can evolve and flourish. But when tomorrow arrives and the patterns repeat, hope begins to falter. The collapse of hope is not immediate, but it is decisive. Psychologically, humans are pattern-seeking beings. The brain monitors consistency and adjusts expectations accordingly. If repeated experiences contradict the promises of change, if the emotional input continues to be ignored or invalidated, the mind begins to recalibrate. It does not stop her from loving, but it stops her from imagining a future that feels safe or nourishing. She may still feel attachment, still crave intimacy, still remember the laughter and warmth they once shared, but the anticipation of a better tomorrow, the expectation that efforts will be met with reciprocity, slowly erodes. She no longer invests in outcomes that feel improbable. Hope is a fragile organism. It dies when it cannot survive in the soil of repeated disappointment. What is most haunting about this process is that it is invisible to the partner. They may believe that she is still hopeful because she has not left. They may interpret her continued presence as a sign of forgiveness, of patience, of trust. But internally, she has stopped waiting. Her mind has begun to run scenarios without him. Her heart quietly imagines life beyond the relationship. She continues to give love, but now it is tempered, measured, protective. She no longer expects the kind of attention or responsiveness that once sustained her. Love without hope becomes a self-contained emotion, rich and deep, but untethered from the possibility of transformation. This is why some departures seem sudden. It is not the absence of love that causes the departure, it is the absence of hope. Real life provides countless examples of this silent unraveling. A woman may spend months, even years, repeatedly expressing her needs, repeatedly witnessing neglect, repeatedly hoping for acknowledgement. She may continue to cook, to care, to nurture, all while internally tallying the emotional cost, all while realizing that the patterns are unlikely to change. Eventually, she stops anticipating change. She no longer counts on apologies, conversations, or promises. She may still engage with affection, still laugh at shared jokes, still carry emotional warmth in private moments, but the thread of hope that links her love to future possibility is gone. Once that thread is severed, the path to leaving becomes clear. Love remains, yes, but the belief in a viable shared future has quietly dissipated. This shift is profoundly misunderstood by those who remain unaware of it. Many mistake it for calm, for patience, for tolerance. They fail to recognize that the mind, when stripped of hope, recalibrates its emotional investments. She is still loving, still present, but the internal narrative has changed. The heart may still beat for connection, but the imagination no longer entertains the scenario where her needs are met. She has begun to invest in herself, in her own stability, in her own growth. She has begun to measure the relationship not by the depth of emotion it generates, but by the likelihood of reciprocity. And once that probability falls below a critical threshold, the psyche prepares for departure even before the body acts. The death of hope is a protective mechanism. It is not cruel, it is survival. It allows her to detach slowly, to conserve energy, to rebuild boundaries, and to begin imagining a life where she is seen and valued. And paradoxically, this stage is often when love is at its strongest internally. She may still feel the intensity of emotion, still care deeply, still mourn what is slipping away. But hope, the belief in change and mutual fulfillment, has already faded. It is the quiet, invisible precursor to walking away, the stage where she has already chosen herself even if the relationship still exists externally. This is why attempts to beg, plead, or promise sudden change rarely succeed at this point. Hope is no longer negotiable, it is gone. Before a woman leaves, she leaves first within herself. She begins to withdraw in a way that is quiet, almost imperceptible, but profoundly significant. Emotional detachment does not announce itself with anger or confrontation. It begins as a subtle reorientation of the inner world, a slow disengagement from the need to regulate, to please, to explain, or to secure validation from the person she loves. The energy she once devoted to connection, once dedicated to bridging gaps, soothing fears, and aligning hearts, gradually turns inward. She stops seeking reassurance because she has recognized that the reassurance, when offered, is temporary and unreliable. She stops investing in arguments or clarifications because the repetition of being unheard has taught her that effort alone cannot sustain understanding. What remains is a quiet, self-contained presence, carrying love without expectation, care without dependency, and respect for herself without compromise. This phase is invisible to the partner. He may believe she is at peace, serene, or simply easier to be with, when in reality she has begun to detach, emotionally and spiritually, from the dynamics that once drew her so deeply into the relationship. She smiles, she laughs, she participates, but the fire that once lit her expressions is diminished. It is no longer absent, but contained, restrained, carefully preserved for herself. She is no longer fully dependent on the emotional reciprocity of another person to maintain her sense of self-worth or emotional stability. She is self-regulating, and it is this self-regulation, invisible to the outside eye, that marks the beginning of a profound internal shift. The reason this detachment is so powerful is that it changes everything about how she experiences the relationship. Where she once may have experienced joy or contentment as contingent upon his presence, now she experiences it from within. She may still care, but the care is no longer a currency exchanged for validation. The laughter, the tenderness, the affection, all of it becomes a personal choice, not an obligation, and certainly not a survival strategy. Psychologically, the mind seeks equilibrium, and repeated neglect or disregard forces a recalibration. Her nervous system no longer relies on the other to regulate it. Her internal world, once open and dependent, begins to close around a new core of self-preservation, quietly reconstructing the boundaries that were eroded by repeated disappointment. There are subtle signs that accompany this detachment. She may stop over-explaining herself. She may stop expressing frustrations as urgently. She may engage less in arguments because arguments no longer serve to maintain the connection. They merely drain the energy she has decided to protect. She may seem more distant, even when physically present. The intimacy that once depended on vulnerability and shared emotional labor is replaced by a calm, contained distance. To the unobservant, it may look like harmony, like resolution, like comfort. But this calm is deceptive. It is the mind and heart creating a safe interior space in preparation for what may eventually need to be externalized, the act of leaving. Real-life experiences show this pattern repeatedly. Consider a woman who has repeatedly raised concerns about her partner's attention, responsiveness, or emotional availability. At first, she reacts passionately, engages fully, perhaps even argues and pleads, trying to restore balance. When repeated PTS fail, she begins to hold her inner life closer. She stops seeking validation and starts cultivating her own emotional resources. She still smiles at his jokes, still participates in shared activities, but internally, she's begun to observe herself from a distance. She measures her energy, protects her boundaries, and, in subtle ways, rehearses a life beyond the relationship, even as the relationship continues, in its familiar rhythm. This detachment is not a sign of cruelty or the absence of love. On the contrary, it often coincides with some of the deepest love she has ever felt, because love without hope or reciprocity does not disappear, it simply becomes self-contained. The mind knows that investing in a system that cannot meet its needs is unsustainable. Emotional detachment is the mind's way of saying, I will care, but I will not be harmed. I will love, but I will not be broken. It is both a defense and a preparation. Once the attachment to validation, responsiveness, or emotional reciprocity weakens, the heart begins to consider what it truly needs: respect, recognition, and an environment where love can thrive, not merely survive. It is during this phase that many relationships begin to falter irreversibly. The partner, unaware of the internal shift, interprets calmness, absence of complaints, or decreased reactivity as improvement, not realizing that the emotional bond has quietly loosened. What was once a source of connection, the heart, the vulnerability, the shared intimacy, has been recalibrated internally. She is still present, but she is no longer dependent. She is still loving, but she no longer needs to be understood to survive. And in this quiet art, recalibration, the trajectory of the relationship is subtly, yet irrevocably changed. The emotional detachment before physical departure is a profound human phenomenon. It is silent, almost invisible, yet more powerful than any argument or confrontation. It is not about hate, indifference, or apathy. It is about self-preservation, clarity, and the recognition that one cannot continually give and remain whole if the effort is not met with meaningful reciprocity. It is the prelude to action, the internal alignment of mind and heart with what is necessary for survival and dignity. By the time the body moves, the soul has already set the course. The departure is no longer a reaction. It is the final, inevitable expression of a process that has quietly unfolded long before the door closes. At some point, a woman begins to feel the quiet stirrings of herself returning. It does not happen suddenly, nor does it arrive with fanfare or announcement. It begins as a small, almost imperceptible recognition of what she has lost. The parts of herself that were once vivid, confident, and alive, now dulled or hidden beneath compromise, over-explanation, and the weight of tending to a connection that demanded more than it gave. She may notice herself recalling desires, interests, or values that were once central to her being, and she begins to question what she has surrendered in order to maintain a relationship that no longer nourished her soul. The reclamation of identity is the mind and heart whispering, sometimes urgently, sometimes tenderly, you are more than this dynamic. You are more than the expectations and the dismissals. You are not defined by the neglect or indifference you have endured. It often starts subtly. Perhaps she revisits hobbies she had abandoned, reconnects with friends she had distanced herself from, or begins making choices that prioritize her own well-being instead of constantly measuring her actions against the emotional comfort of another. The reclamation is rarely loud. It is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, determined, internal. Yet its power is absolute because it signals a shift in the balance between the self and the relationship. She begins to see that her value does not reside in the approval, affection, or attention of the one who has overlooked her needs. She begins to understand, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that the most profound connection is with herself. Psychologically, this process is deeply transformative. For a woman who has invested years of emotional energy, love, and effort into a partnership that has not reciprocated fully, identity often becomes entangled with the relationship. She may have defined herself as the caretaker, the patient partner, the one who adjusts, forgives, and hopes. She may have silenced parts of her personality, her ambitions, and her desires to avoid conflict to maintain harmony, or simply to survive emotionally. Reclaiming her identity is not just an act of defiance, it is a necessity. The psyche cannot flourish when selfhood is sacrificed continuously. It begins to assert itself, even if softly at first, demanding recognition, space, and autonomy. The reclamation is often misunderstood by the partner. He may perceive her renewed confidence, independence, and self-expression as arrogance, distance, or change, failing to see that this is her coming home to herself. He may think she has grown different or unreachable, when in fact she is simply remembering who she was before she allowed her own needs to be secondary. She may begin to set boundaries more firmly, voice opinions that were previously suppressed, and make decisions that are aligned with her values rather than the expectations of the relationship. This is not rebellion, it is a restoration of equilibrium. She is no longer bending to fit a mold that eroded her sense of self. She is, quietly and powerfully, reclaiming herself. Real-life experience illustrates this clearly. A woman may have spent years molding herself to accommodate a partner's moods, desires, or routines. She may have let go of passions, postponed dreams, or silenced ambitions in order to maintain peace or acceptance. Slowly, she begins to remember what it felt like to be alive before those compromises. Perhaps she signs up for a class she once loved, begins expressing herself artistically, or reconnects with a supportive community. Each small act becomes a declaration. She exists beyond the relationship. She is not defined solely by it. Each step strengthens her sense of autonomy, teaching her that she can be whole, joyful, and complete on her own terms. Emotionally, this process is both painful and liberating. Painful because it forces her to confront the reality of how much she sacrificed, and liberating because it illuminates the possibility of wholeness, strength, and authenticity. In reclaiming her identity, she no longer allows the relationship to dictate her emotional landscape. She may continue to care, continue to love, but now her emotions are grounded in self-respect rather than conditional acceptance. She may engage with kindness, but not at the expense of herself. She may forgive, but not forget the lessons her heart has painfully learned. The reclamation of identity also changes the internal dialogue. She no longer asks, "Am I enough for him? Or will he ever see me?" Instead, she asks, "Am I enough for myself? And what do I need to thrive?" These questions are subtle yet revolutionary. They signal a shift from external validation to internal sovereignty, from dependence to self-directed power. The mind, which once focused obsessively on whether she was loved and understood, now focuses on nurturing the self, recognizing value, and protecting emotional and psychological integrity. This process is not merely preparatory for leaving, it is a profound transformation in its own right. By reclaiming her identity, she becomes the center of her own world again. She no longer sacrifices essential pieces of herself to maintain a connection that diminishes her. She is stronger, clearer, and more whole. And paradoxically, it is only after this reclamation that the decision to stay or leave becomes clear, because she can now evaluate the relationship not through the lens of fear, obligation, or hope for change, but through the lens of alignment, respect, and authenticity. At the final stage, the transformation is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet irreversible. It is the moment when a woman no longer measures her presence, her happiness, or her worth through the lens of the relationship. She has already endured the silence, the erosion of hope, the emotional withdrawal, and the reclamation of her identity. She has observed, patiently and often painfully, how the connection has failed to meet the depth of her emotional, psychological, and spiritual needs. And now, her mind and heart converge on a truth so quiet and absolute that it cannot be ignored. She will choose peace over attachment. It is not a sudden rebellion or an impulsive act. It is a calm, conscious decision rooted in self-preservation and clarity. Peace in This context is not merely the absence of conflict, it is the presence of alignment. It is the recognition that her emotional equilibrium, her dignity, and her wholeness cannot survive in a dynamic that repeatedly fails to honor them. Attachment, no matter how deep, is a tether to an external source for validation, security, or fulfillment. Peace, on the other hand, is an internal state, a sovereignty of the soul that does not require negotiation or compromise to be sustained. When a woman reaches this stage, she evaluates the cost of staying not just in terms of comfort or affection, but in terms of the health of her inner life. She no longer tolerates imbalance, disrespect, or neglect, because she has learned through experience that attachment without reciprocity is a slow erosion of the self. The shift is profound because it represents a transcendence of emotion over reaction. She may still feel love, still recall warmth, still remember moments of connection with vivid clarity. These emotions are real and valid, but they no longer dictate her choices. She may care deeply, but she no longer fears loss as the primary determinant of her actions. Her attachment has been tempered, refined, and ultimately redirected inward. Psychologically, this is a stage of mastery over the patterns that once held her captive. The mind, once consumed by hope and expectation, now seeks harmony, clarity, and self-alignment. The heart, once dependent on reciprocation, now rests in the sovereignty of its own completeness. This is why the final departure, if it comes, appears inevitable yet calm. She does not rage, plead, or bargain. She does not attempt to salvage what has already been used and found wanting. Instead, she moves with a quiet decisiveness born of clarity. She has weighed the cost of continued investment and determined that her inner peace is more valuable than the attachment that once held her. It is a decision made with dignity, not vengeance, with calm, not chaos. She leaves not because she has stopped loving, but because she has started valuing herself more than the relationship itself. In real life, this stage manifests in subtle but unmistakable behaviors. She may disengage from arguments entirely, recognizing that conflict no longer yields growth or understanding. She may stop seeking reassurance or validation, understanding that her emotional stability is self-sustained. She may prioritize her own space, her own routines, and her own aspirations, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. Every choice reflects an internal alignment with her values, her boundaries, and her need for emotional integrity. The final shift is a culmination of all previous psychological transformations. She has withdrawn effort where it is unreciprocated. She has reclaimed her identity, and now she affirms her right to peace. Emotionally, this is a stage of profound liberation. There is a lightness that comes with no longer tethering one's emotional state to the whims, inconsistencies, or shortcomings of another. There is clarity in recognizing that attachment, when unbalanced, is a form of bondage, and that true freedom comes from prioritizing harmony within oneself over the desire to sustain a connection at any cost. She may feel sadness, nostalgia, or even grief for what has been lost, but these emotions no longer possess the power to compel compromise or prolong suffering. She moves forward with intentionality, with self-respect, and with the knowledge that her peace is non-negotiable. This shift also teaches a profound lesson about human connection. Love is not sufficient to sustain a relationship when it exists in isolation from respect, reciprocity, and alignment. Attachment alone, even if intense, cannot replace the necessity for mutual recognition and emotional nourishment. When these are absent, the psyche naturally gravitates toward preservation. The final shift is the embodiment of this principle. It is the point at which the mind, heart, and soul converge in the singular pursuit of self-preservation through peace. In essence, she becomes untethered from the past, from expectation, and from the need to justify her worth to another. She chooses herself over the comfort of attachment, knowing that the calm and integrity of her inner world is far more valuable than the illusion of security that a faltering relationship can offer. This is the moment where clarity becomes power. She moves forward not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of a deep recognition that her emotional life deserves to be tended with reverence and care. The final shift, peace over attachment, is the silent, invisible pivot that precedes action. By the time it manifests externally, it is often too late for intervention. She has already decided internally what she will tolerate and what she will not. She has already measured the cost of staying against the cost of leaving, and concluded that peace is worth more than attachment. It is a profound, almost sacred realignment, a decision that prioritizes the inner world over external expectation, self-respect over fear of loss, and dignity over desperation. It is this shift that completes the psychological journey, transforming love and pain into wisdom, loss into clarity, and attachment into freedom. It is a quiet, powerful moment of awakening, where a woman reclaims her life, her energy, and her peace, leaving behind not only the relationship but also the emotional patterns that once constrained her. By the time she steps away, the journey has already been completed internally. The exterior departure is only the final, graceful acknowledgement of an inner truth that has long been established. A woman doesn't walk away when she stops loving. She walks away when she stops believing that her voice matters, believing that change is possible, believing that staying won't cost her sense of self. The tragedy is not that she leaves, but that the signs were present long before the door closed. And the lesson: pay attention not to when a woman walks away, but to when she goes quiet, withdraws hope, and chooses inner peace, because by then, she has already left.